My name is Richard Gowan. I'm an associate director at New York University's Center on International Cooperation. CIC is a research unit based at NYU back in New York. We're not a teaching department. We do research primarily on issues relating to the UN and other multilateral organizations. A lot of that research is directly commissioned by the UN or a range of governments, including Norway, Canada, and even sometimes the US. I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Stedman. Stephen is a long-time friend and associate of CIC. His formal title is very long, but I'm going to try and get it right. He is the Freeman Spogli Senior Fellow at the Center of Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, where he's also a professor of political science. Steve is a guru, I think, for those of us who are interested in conflict management and multilateral affairs. He edited a book called Ending Civil Wars, which is the Bible of those who want to end civil wars. And we'll be talking a little about that this evening. In 2004, he led the research for Kofi Annan's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. And he then worked with Annan in the lead up to the 2005 World Summit, which was the great occasion where all the heads of government from around the world came together at the UN and tried to patch up the damage done after the Iraq War. The high-level panel's report, which Steve in essence wrote, is still one of the best summaries of the state of international security today and the threats we face. One of the other best summaries of those problems is a book that Steve co-authored in 2008 called Power and Responsibility. He wrote that with Bruce Jones and Carlos Pascual, and that's a volume that has done an immense amount to inform the Obama administration's approach to multilateralism. At the same time, he still teaches and actually runs a dorm back at Stanford University, and he's working with Kofi Annan again on a commission on democracy and elections, which we'll be talking about a little later this evening. But we're going to start this conversation by talking about events in the Middle East. In Power and Responsibility, you spoke a lot about the changing nature of sovereignty in a world where not only economic dynamics, but transnational threats like terrorism and changing biotechnology meant that old ideas of sovereignty were no longer credible or feasible. And in that volume, you talked about the need for a concept of responsible sovereignty. And that this was quite a complex idea, one that has been echoed again by the Obama administration. But part of that idea was that states have to earn sovereignty by respecting and defending the human rights of their peoples. In the last year, we've heard a lot about responsible sovereignty and the responsibility to protect, first in the context of Libya, and now in the context of Syria. And even members of the Russian government have talked about President Assad's responsibility to his people. Do you think that what we're seeing at the moment in debates over Libya and Syria represents a real shift in the way that governments view sovereignty, or is this merely tactical diplomatic language?
It's a bit of both, and I want to start by talking about responsible sovereignty and the way that we meant it. As you mentioned, Richard, we talked about a whole host of different issues, not just questions of civil wars or failed states or responses to mass atrocity. We were writing about transnational threats such as climate change, economic instability, biological terrorism, but also deadly infectious disease, a host of transnational threats. And the basic idea was that in an interdependent world, every country needed the cooperation of others if they wanted to secure themselves. And that in an interdependent world, to exercise responsible sovereignty, you also had to take care about the negative externalities of your pursuit of security. That is, if in trying to make your own self secure, you endangered others, there was a real problem, okay? I'll talk in a minute about the record on those transnational threats, because I think it's important. But I just wanted to start that way so people understood that we weren't talking just about response to atrocities, response to failed states, response to human rights abuses within states. It was a whole host of different issues that we were saying you needed responsibility, you needed responsible sovereignty for. If you turn to Libya, I was stunned actually by the response. It's true in 2005, in the document that we prepared for Kofi Annan, which was then negotiated and was signed off on by 175 heads of state, the General Assembly endorsed the concept of responsibility to protect, which said if countries, in cases where there are mass atrocities, if a country can't protect its own citizens, either because it's unable to or unwilling to, that responsibility then falls to the international community to then protect those civilians. And my argument is that by simply accepting that formulation, however many caveats you want to put on it, by accepting the formulation that responsibility for protecting citizens can fall to the international community, 175 heads of state and the General Assembly basically put conditions on sovereignty. It simply said that sovereignty is not unconditional. If you are a sovereign country, you cannot engage in mass atrocities against your population. There is a responsibility that you take up to protect your own civilians. That was in writing. It was a General Assembly resolution accepted at a normative basis. Then the question was, well, is it real? That is, you can have all kinds of normative proclamations. You have them all the time in terms of human rights. But then is there any bite to it? And in the case of Libya, what you saw was the Security Council acting to say, in fact, there was a responsibility. And then acting accordingly and being willing to intervene militarily. I think almost in the immediate aftermath of the Security Council authorization of the use of force in Libya, you saw buyer's remorse by a number of countries. This buyer's remorse was exacerbated by how quickly the Obama administration seemed to have gone from there is a responsibility to protect civilians to Gaddafi has to go, which was almost in the first 24 hours, right? Which for some countries reinforced the belief that at least for the United States, when the United States talks about a responsibility to protect, they're talking about regime change. In fairness to the Obama administration, they said, well, we actually have a case here where if you actually want to protect the population of Benghazi and if you want to protect civilians in Libya, you're not going to be able to do it as long as Gaddafi is in charge. And that became the point of disagreement. And people were saying at the time, all right, you got Libya, but you're never going to see this again, right? You then have Syria. And here, as it did in Libya, the Arab League has played a leading role. Again, go back to 2005 when this document was accepted at the United Nations. Unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. You would have made a lot of money on that bet in 2005 that within 7 years, the Arab League will have invoked this principle twice, the Arab League. But it did. Unhappy with the veto of China and Russia at the Security Council, said, well, we'll take it to the General Assembly. And 150 or so countries at the General Assembly accepted and voted for a resolution that basically said that the president of Syria has to step down, and that sovereignty was not unconditional. So on this set of issues, I think it's been remarkable where it's gone. But now if you look at the other issues, it's a real mixed bag. On something like climate change, there's little evidence right now that countries are acting under any kind of principle of responsible sovereignty. Right? The major emitters certainly aren't. Major negative externalities as they continue their policies, and in the case of the United States, a fundamental unwillingness to really engage. On food security, you see the policies of the United States, the EU, India, China in some regards, all having negative externalities for the food security of the billion poorest people in the world. And you don't see much action on that. So very much mixed. So you say, well, why? Why are you getting progress on some issues and not on others? What's intriguing is that in terms of the use of force and the responsibility to protect, this is actually something that executives have more autonomy to address. Right? President Obama basically made a decision that by fiat and said to Congress, this is the resolution and we are supporting NATO. And they basically then engaged in a whole kind of series of legal shenanigans, but basically exerting executive authority to make this decision. And basically saying, Congress, you have no role in this and you're not even going to discuss it. You can discuss it, but don't think that you have any role here. They can't do that on climate change. They can't do that on food security. You can't do that on trade. You can't do that on economic insecurity. Why? Because these are all issues that used to be low politics. They're distributional issues. They're in legislatures. There's all kinds of log rolling, pork barrel politics, all this stuff that goes into legislatures being involved that really constrain the ability of executives to act. So it's a very mixed scorecard in terms of responsible sovereignty. That's what I would say.
We'll come back to the US in a moment, but to stay with events in the Middle East and specifically now Syria. As you say, there's a huge amount of diplomatic activity over Syria. There's a surprisingly large coalition of countries aiming for some sort of political transition. There is a lot of talk about sending in peacekeepers and other crisis management options. But to many of us looking at this closely, there still doesn't really seem to be a good plan to end this mess. Given your work on ending civil wars, firstly, how do you think this crisis can be concluded? And what should be the plan in the 3 to 6 months or 1 to 2 years after the conclusion of the immediate conflict to get Syria back up on its feet again? I ask that second question because it's now exactly 1 year, or I think a year and a day, since the Libyan conflict really began. It's 6 months since Gaddafi fell, but there is quite a lot of evidence that Libya is potentially going in a very bad direction after the main hostilities ended.
Yeah. So the short answer on the second question is, I don't know, we don't know, and anybody who said, what has to be done in Syria for, a period that will bring Syria back to its feet, don't know. Because one thing that we know about ending civil wars and making peace in their aftermath is that you don't take a formula off a shelf, right? You really do have to know something about the situation and the context. And we don't know what the end game is. And the end game is going to be very, very important in terms of what comes afterwards. If you just think about contrasting the transitions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, you see very, very different end games, all of which have their own dynamics in terms of transition and what comes afterwards, right? On the first question, this stuff is very difficult. And part of its difficulty is that it's very fluid. You haven't fallen into a case where you've got a protracted civil war where both sides are coming to some belief that they can't win outright, right? Which is usually the case when you get a negotiated settlement to a civil war. You've actually had fighting for a long time. The parties have exhausted themselves and then start realizing what might be second best. But unlike many, I have to actually tell mediators this, countries at civil war, parties that engage in violence and in civil war, don't do it to make jobs for mediators, right? They do it because they care about something, they care about power, and they're trying to win power, right? And the only reason that they even engage in talking to a mediator is when they think that they can't attain what they want, or they think that they can attain what they want in a less costly way. Part of the difficulty in Syria is that we don't even know, are we really in a civil war? In the sense that, do you really have very clearly organized rebels? Is it really a rebel army? Are there parts of the population that basically are willing to recognize the opposition army as sovereign in its own right? Or is it a case where this is mass protest, it's violent, it's sporadically violent, you do have organized violence, but they're not making claims in terms of being the state, and you are trying to get a government out of power. You're trying to, in essence, create some kind of transition that's almost revolutionary. Right? It would be revolutionary. Now, for outsiders, there's a recognition by at least 150 countries and the Arab League. The best game in town, right, if you want to forestall violence, is to get Assad out of the country, basically. That as long as Assad is president, you have no chance of getting any kind of early settlement. And this is going to snowball, and it's going to go the route of a protracted violence and a protracted will-be civil war, right? Now, for those who oppose it, so let's just take the two countries that exercise the veto, Russia and China. Russia and China don't want a repeat of Libya. They don't want a military intervention. They don't want a forceful intervention from outsiders. What it seems to me is that if they don't want a forceful intervention by outsiders, then it's incumbent upon them to say, here is an alternative, right? That is, here is an alternative that we have that's going to address the concerns of the 150, and including the Arab League, that this has to stop. I know that the Chinese are talking to Assad. I know that the Russian foreign minister just visited. I also know that the Russians are pumping in a lot of arms. It doesn't seem like the Russians in particular have an answer as to, how do you end this, unless the answer is Assad, get it over with. But at least for China, it seems to me that China does not have an interest in intervention, but it certainly doesn't have an interest in a protracted civil war. So is it willing to use whatever leverage it has in addressing Assad? I don't know. But if they are interested in something short of a protracted civil war without international engagement, intervention, then they should be having some frank discussions. If they're not, then I would say it's up to the Arab League to be having frank discussions with Russia and China. To say, at this point, you say this is not the way to go. You vetoed our solution. What is your solution?
I would say watching the Syria debate play out in New York, there's one other important dimension, which is while Russia and China say they don't want a military intervention, there is no serious threat of a military intervention. NATO is not secretly preparing a massive bombing campaign against Syria, unless they're really fooling us all. And so this is one reason why the diplomacy moves so slowly, and Russia and China have not offered an amazing range of alternatives because they know that there is not real pressure for violence. Whereas in the Libyan case, there was genuine pressure coming from the Europeans and the US.
Yeah, I don't think that you need the threat of bombing to get to a protracted civil war, or to my mind, to force action. The various talk that's been out there about, arming the rebels, massive arming of the rebels, recognition, all this stuff, that should be getting their attention. Because you have massive shipments of arms against the state in Syria, and you're going to have the protracted war. And then it may not be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, but somewhere down the road, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that you could have outside intervention.
Picking up on your references to the Arab League, I mean, this sort of change in the League's behavior, for me, it's very reminiscent of what we saw with the African Union over the crisis in Darfur. You saw a regional organization suddenly respond to a major humanitarian challenge by really altering its whole attitude to intervention and crisis management. Do you see the League continuing to play this role, perhaps taking on a more structured role in peacekeeping in other crises? Or is this a temporary phenomenon?
Short answer, I don't know. I think what they've done well so far has been their discovery that they can actually use concerted diplomacy well. And they've used it at the United Nations well. I think the one misstep was the observation mission, which was not a misstep in terms of an idea, but the way it was carried out, sort of the lack of clarity about what it was doing, the guy that they chose to send in to head the mission was downright amateurish. And so what you would hope is that if they want to play more of a role, that they don't make some of the mistakes that the AU made. And some of those mistakes by the AU were the mistakes of, we can do everything ourselves. And they can't. And so it's better to acknowledge that at the beginning and figure out how you're going to work with others, as opposed to saying as the AU tried to do, African solutions to African problems, only to find out, not really. Yeah.
Switching back to the US, you made some observations about how constrained the Obama administration has been on issues like climate change by Congress. More generally, there was a great deal of optimism back in 2008, 2009, that the Obama administration would usher in a new era of multilateral US policy and a greater respect for international law. Can you go into a bit more detail about how you would grade the administration's performance, and also how you see the current election affecting US policy, whoever wins in November?
Right. It's a mixed bag. For somebody, so I have to say, where am I coming from in this? I voted for Obama. I supported him. I have a lot of friends who were in the administration, and had very high expectations. My high expectations have not anywhere nearly been met. But I will also admit that I set high expectations. So it's a very mixed bag. And it's probably, again, the irony to me is that if you think about sort of American traditional security concerns, that's probably where Obama has actually done the best. Getting troops out of Iraq and wrapping up Iraq, the pivot in Asia, right? Libya, where that is not just doing an intervention, but supporting an intervention that NATO then did. Going after bin Laden. Russia, the reset with Russia. All the very traditional stuff, use of force stuff, right? And then you look on, it's like climate change. He hasn't done very, very well at being able to convince the G20 that really it's about stimulus, not austerity. Terrorism, real mixed bag. Probably done better on nuclear proliferation. But again, that's a very traditional, and at least in the United States, it's a very traditional presidential issue, right? Nuclear issues. He's done better on Iran than I think most people would have thought. But much less so on the transnational new issues, of which he's written so eloquently. If you turn to the Middle East, again, a mixed bag. Again, he himself set high expectations in the Cairo speech. And he did something in the Cairo speech which you should never do, which is you should never threaten another country unless you actually mean it. In that case, it was Israel, and it was about settlements. And as far as we can tell, that was a throwaway line into that speech. But throwaway lines, if you include them, can have consequence. And that certainly was one of them. So I would think up until the point that you got to Egypt, Libya, to the awakening, most people would say this Middle East policy is really underachieving. Right? I'm being, nice here. Really underachieving. Look at the state of Israel and Palestine. Iraq, okay, he's making progress on Iraq. And even Iran, the ability to try to mobilize real pressure on Iran was flagging in the first couple of years, in part by their own choice, right? Because Obama actually wanted a reset with Iran, and during Iran's flawed elections and the mobilization and protest in the aftermath of their flawed elections, the Americans seemed pretty hamstrung. But then you fast forward to Egypt. Now, in the Middle East, what did Obama care about? Obama cared about, again, Iraq, getting America out of Iraq without it blowing up, and two, mobilizing some kind. If he couldn't get a compromise, some kind of détente with Iran, then you want to mobilize to contain Iran. That was its concerns. And then all of a sudden comes Egypt. Now, what's interesting about Egypt, and so my argument is going to be, in the case of Egypt, in the case of Libya, those within the Obama administration that actually care about democracy could make an argument and not be opposed by those who care about Iraq and Iran, right? Because whatever you think about Egypt and whatever you think about Libya, Egypt and Libya were not going to be crucial players in whether the end game in Iraq is going to be stable and whether you're going to have a real great coalition to contain Iran, right? But even then, it was a close-run game. And the close-run game in the case of Egypt was all the people who have been working on the Middle East, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, right? Many of them the same people were saying, oh no, this is going to undermine the peace process, undermine the peace process. And finally somebody had to say, what peace process? What are your successes that this is going to undermine? Right? It's not, we're not on the edge of peace here, right? They couldn't make that argument because they had, in fact, had underachieved and failed on that in the first 2 years. Might have been a different game on Egypt if they had actually made more progress, but they didn't. So nobody could really make the argument that if you come out and say that you are in support of transition in Egypt, Gaddafi has to go, Mubarak has to go, that you're really undermining, vital American interests in the Middle East, right? And you are, and by the way, all the voices of you're on the right side of history, you're for democracy, you're for human rights, right? Take Bahrain. Well, now all of a sudden you have a country that matters. Why? Bahrain actually matters in terms of the end game in Iraq. Bahrain matters in terms of mobilization against Iran. And it's a very different politics went on in the White House. And the people who were saying right side of history, democracy, and human rights got trumped by those who said vital national interests, Iraq endgame, Iran. Actually China and Russia missed a beautiful opportunity to have taken Bahrain to the Security Council back last year to put the Americans in a very tough position in terms of the responsibility to protect. But that's not in their sort of game plan. That's not in their repertoire. So, again, mixed.
And do you think that, I'm not going to ask if you're going to vote for him again, but if President Obama were...
Well, I am going to vote for him again because, it's like, look at my alternatives.
He's got another vote in California. But assuming that we don't end up with President Santorum, do you think that an Obama administration in a second term would follow similar policies, or do you think that it might catch up with the initial expectations on issues like climate change? Or indeed the Middle East peace process?
Yeah. A second-term Obama administration, I would think that the absolute first priority for them is, again, going back to very traditional sort of international relations concerns, is they want to wind down Afghanistan. They want to get out of Afghanistan. They want to wind it down. They want to do it in such a way that instability in South Asia isn't greatly increased, right? And that's going to be the concern in the first 2 years of an Obama administration. Would it be willing to to act on climate change, on energy. First thing would be, what happens in the congressional elections in November? So what kind of Congress does Obama have to deal with? How much of a victory does he get in November? Are the Republicans, could anyone actually imagine that the Republicans would be chastened to actually decide, no, we actually want to govern and make policies as opposed to just say no to everything? And if that were the case, then you could imagine, you would need a shift in domestic politics for Obama to say, all right, now we're going to get serious about energy, right? There's going to be some losers, there's going to be some winners, but we're going to get serious about this. Yeah, if it's, if he's got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and he's just squeaked by, hard to imagine, right?
When you talk to people in Washington about how the administration has not met all expectations, one response you sometimes get is, well, we tried, but China did not reciprocate, or India did not reciprocate, for example, over climate change. You'll even hear a lot of criticism in Washington of Brazil for having attempted to form its own Iran policy, or failing to support the Libya vote at the UN. Now, this is classic diplomatic game playing, but as you look at other powers, other members of the G20 especially, would you accept some of those criticisms of their attitude to meeting transnational threats? And are there countries which you feel have actually excelled, or at least played a significant role in promoting cooperation beyond the US?
Yeah. It's hard because on some of the most key issues, whether or not, pick a country.
Luxembourg.
Whether or not Luxembourg has been absolutely terrific and an exemplar of responsible sovereignty just doesn't matter. I mean, it's nice, it's wonderful. I hope I haven't offended any Luxembourgeois. I mean, on the issues, to solve these issues, it's, at a minimum, it's United States, China, India, Brazil, EU, with some others, depending on the issue, right? You then start broadening out, right? But if you don't have them not only at the table, but also coming to solutions, some of these problems just aren't going to get solved, right? You take something like food security. Now, food security, so you have 1 billion people in the world who suffer from malnutrition, who go hungry, right? It's still, one of the biggest killers in the world. Far more people die from food insecurity than they do. I'm not just talking famine, I'm talking about chronic malnutrition, right? Far more people die every year from food insecurity than they do from any war anywhere in the world, right? And like I said, you can look at a whole host of policies that the United States follows, that the EU follows, that India follows. Here, Brazil is actually pretty good, right? But that China follows that have negative externalities. That is, they may provide food security at home, but at a cost of insecurity to others, right? When India uses export bans, right, on rice, what does it do? It jacks up the price for the most vulnerable everywhere else, right? The policies that China's engaged in terms of large land acquisitions in Africa, this is a disaster just waiting to unfold. The United States with biofuel subsidies, right, and the EU with farm subsidies, right? There's a number of things in the package. But notice that it's not clear with these countries, why would they give any of these things up, right? So I try to play this out. The United States says to India, we really care about food security of the billion at the bottom. You should stop doing food export bans when things get tough in your country. And they say, no. And the United States says, oh, okay. Because it doesn't matter to the United States, right? It's just, it does not matter to the United States. The United States really does, what is the dog in the fight? Unclear. So on this issue, that's clearly an issue where the 4 or 5 are not enough, and there's no mechanism to get each other to do the policies that are right. That's only going to come when you have some kind of voice and some kind of influence and leverage from everybody else, right? If you go back to the first question, I mean, when you were saying about the administration itself, their excuse. Yeah, it is. They are right that on some key issues, it turns out that Brazil has other ideas in the United States, China has other ideas in the United States, India has other ideas in the United States. The question is, in the face of those differences, do you then throw up your hands and say, oh, well, we tried multilateralism, just as every administration has ever said, multilateralism doesn't work, and then we're going to go back to doing our own thing. I don't think they've done that, by the way. I actually think, I do give them credit. They have tried to be more multilateral than any administration I know. And they haven't given up, because that was my great fear, is that any administration in the face of difficulty simply reverts to old habits. And in the case of American foreign policy, old habits is we do whatever we damn please, and we live with the consequences, good and bad. And they really haven't done that. So yeah, this is tough. It's going to take a long time. It's not something that is going to happen overnight. And I mean, my biggest fear, when we wrote the book on power and responsibility, I think all of our worst fear was that it's going to take the manifestation of some of these threats, the real manifestation, the direct occurrence of something awful happen to trigger the global cooperation that you would need, right? We were trying to make an argument that you can still be preventive, right? We can still live in a world where if you could cooperate now, we might not have to realize the worst consequences, whether it's on biological security, nuclear security, deadly infectious disease, you name it, right? Climate change. And I think in the back of our heads was, well, maybe we just do live in a world where governments just don't do the right thing until faced with overwhelming evidence of disaster. And even then it's questionable. As if you just look at how in 2008, right, the G20 is created at heads of state level, and within 4 months it looks like they are going to do stuff, and they're going to, right? Where is the G20 now, right? And where is the EU right now on economic stability at home? So the sobering path is until these latent threats become real, you don't see the action that it would have been great to have had years before.
I don't want to end the conversation on that slightly depressing note. So I was wondering, before we turn over to the audience for some questions and answers, to talk about something which is hopefully positive and may have a lot of policy impact, which is work you're doing with Kofi Annan on democracy and elections. You're leading the research for a new international commission looking at democratization and elections. Tell us about what you're aiming to do with that and how it's working and how Kofi and some other pretty big names are involved.
Yeah. So I'm directing, Kofi asked me to direct a commission that he's chairing. It's called the Global Commission on elections, democracy, and security, which I think just about gets everything in there. It's about the whole world.
You only do things with like
with
incredibly
the whole
long
world.
titles, yeah.
Exactly. So at its heart, the work of the Commission is trying to figure out ways to best promote and protect the integrity of elections, and to make the case for why the integrity of elections is so important for democracy, not just in poor countries, but in middle-income countries and in the older traditional democracies. What our work is doing is showing that depending on context, depending on whether you're a democracy, a striving democracy in Africa, whether you're trying to consolidate democracy in Latin America after 20 years, or whether you're trying to deal with the health of democracy in Western Europe or in North America. Depending on context, there are a whole bunch of different threats to the integrity of elections, and therefore the integrity of democracy and the ability of democracy to produce the kind of positive results that it's supposed to. Some of these are basic, some of them are surprising. But because it's a global commission, we look at democracy everywhere and elections everywhere. And again, we're trying to create an argument for governments and for people who want to pressure their governments as to why credible elections are very important, why it matters, and what they should do about it. It's in a nutshell.
And what is the core of that argument, if you can?
Well, I can't say because we're halfway through the commission, and this is a nice cop-out answer, right? We're halfway through the commission's work. The commission is supposed to produce a report in September. In fact, we'll have our third meeting in April, where we're looking at a series of evaluations of the international role in elections, whether it's election observation or how donors go about building local capacity for democratic governance in elections, and also, quite frankly, international reactions to flawed elections, which has been really poor. If you just want to look over, if you want to be really depressed, take a look at some of our data at international responses to fundamentally flawed elections over the last 40 years, and you find that not a heck of a lot happens. So we're very good at rhetoric, and we're not very good at action. So I'm not going to speak for the commission and say, here are the answers.
I'm interested in your appraisal of Obama as not being completely successful in some of his foreign relations policies carrying through. I would like to ask, what do you think is the reason for that? Is it because he's not experienced enough, or has some other, what other shortcoming does he have?
Okay. So let me be clear. I'll take the last question first. Let me be clear. On some things in foreign policy, he's been very successful. But my point was, the things that he has been most successful on are very traditional international relations concerns, almost all of them in some way involving the use of force. And I don't think anybody would have predicted that when he became president. A whole host of issues that I don't think he has lived up to expectations. In part, as I suggest, are a function of the fact that these new kinds of transnational threats are all mired in domestic politics. The president doesn't have the autonomy that's given to the executive in traditional sort of use of force kinds of questions. you could then step back and say, well, given that, were there things that he could have done differently in 2009, 2010 that might have made a difference? And the only sort of path that I would suggest going down would be to say, was it a mistake for him to decide that he was going to roll the dice in the first year of his administration on getting a health care bill that nobody had been able to get in 100 years, right? Because that consumed, for the next 14 months, and then having to defend it and play defense, consumed the administration's attention. And the choice, I think, that he had was, and some of his advisors put this to him, was you don't do that. It's too hard. It's too inflammatory. And if you are going to throw a lot of your capital and your time and your attention into a really tough issue, the one to go into was energy. And so it's worth at least playing that out to say, if in 2009 he hadn't used all of his time and capital to have gotten health care, what if he had gotten an energy bill in the United States that had actually made the United States a credible player at Copenhagen and had engaged more on Copenhagen in terms of climate change? But that's what I mean by that some of these issues are so mired in domestic politics. Being an IR scholar doesn't help you. You actually have to know something about the domestic politics and what are the possibilities of getting action.
Hi, my name is Diana. I saw one of the headlines today that said that the United States and the EU advised Israel that their plans to attack Iran are not a good idea, basically, which says to me two things: that Israel has plans, and number two is that they're seriously thinking about it, since the US and the EU saw fit to advise them not to do it. Could you comment on this, and could you comment on how that would affect us here in Abu Dhabi?
Sir,
Actually, I wanted to almost ask a very similar question. Again, Iran and US, and what is happening, what is your view? I just would like to add that from my perspective, if you look at the, let's say, Western news, then it's always said that Iran is unpredictable. But from my, let's say, source of intelligence, Iran is very predictable, and they are just playing a game, having a stick and seeing what happens. But for me, US is completely unpredictable. So I would like to see what your view, what might happen, and also what it means for us in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. What could be the, let's say, implications, and how likely it is that we could see, let's say, a battlefield even here?
On EU, US, Iran, and who's predictable and who's unpredictable, I'll let both of you tell me what the implications would be for Abu Dhabi. Is it surprising at all that Israel would have plans somewhere to attack Iran? I find that not surprising at all. I find that completely credible that in terms of their military and strategic planning, that they would have to have contingencies for that, and that they have them. It has been an ongoing sort of issue, at least in blogs and in several journals and a lot of foreign policy chat over the last 2 years, at least in Washington, about Israel threatening to attack Iran. And even to the point of apparently going to the administration, as they did with the Bush administration, apparently. So this sounds like a pattern, going to an American administration and saying, if we do this, what can we expect from you? And the Bush administration in the last year said that this is nuts. This is crazy. This is the Bush administration. this is crazy, this is nuts, don't do it, don't want a part of it. I think what you're getting from the Obama administration is, again, right, this is not helpful. Which is not to say that Israel wouldn't do it. Israel is going to do what they think is important for their security, right? But the EU and the United States, I think, have consistently told them that you will put your security at more peril, even if you were to successfully attack Iran. Imagine you attacked Iran, it was successful in the short term, that you would actually be putting your security at more risk than you are at presently. Iran and the US, again, I mentioned this earlier, the Obama administration actually came to office wanting to change the dynamic, the bilateral dynamic between the United States and Iran. And it was in 2009 when you had the elections, which all of a sudden, first of all, it meant that the leadership in Iran was not going to be meeting with the United States. Secondly, it really caught Obama flat-footed at the beginning, because you want them to be a partner, there's all kinds of stuff going on. What happens if we come out really hard that, in support of the protesters, and the protest is squashed, we still got to deal with these guys, right? And it's early, right? Well, I think they would all say it wasn't their finest hour. They would also say it was really difficult, especially if you wanted to try to change the dynamic of how you were going to engage with Iran. But a great American diplomat who has worked very hard on Iran, a guy named Tom Pickering, his take of the last 10 years was that the tragedy is that when Iran was ready to speak to the United States wasn't interested. And that when the United States was interested in speaking to Iran in 2009, Iran wasn't interested. And so we're pretty adept, both sides, at missing opportunities. But the fact that there are these opportunities does suggest some unpredictability, which I actually think is a good thing, because something has to be done to get out of this dynamic, right? It's just not clear how you do it. So what's going on now? So the administration has very clearly staked its strategy on ratcheting up the pressure and really trying to come up with a sanctions regime that bites. And it's very clear it has bitten. And you're getting very different signals out of Iran. But to my mind, often the success and failure of using sanctions as a tool of foreign policy depends on what you're asking for with the sanctions. Are you asking of Iran that we want specific behavior having to do with your nuclear program? If you change specific behavior, then we will change this web of sanctions, banking prohibitions, financial flow pressure, all this stuff, right? Or is it about regime change? Right? Well, when you guys figure it out and Ahmadinejad is gone and you've opened up and liberalized society, then we're going to, when you tend to ask for regime change, sanctions aren't very successful, right? Because no leader, likes to engage in suicide. But sanctions can be successful if they're used for very specific purpose. And here the United States, again, the United States has habits. It has a habit of unilateral force. I think the Obama administration has tried to be better about that. The United States has a habit of regime change. I think the administration would like to say that they're better at that, but again, how quickly, again, I point to Libya, how quickly it went from protection to regime change. It was like that. So, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know how this is all going to play out with the inspectors. The fact that Iran has once again allowed UN inspectors in, I think that's a good thing. But they are very successful at playing along and not doing things. So let's see what happens this time.
I want to go back to your end point when you talk about you running a commission, and I just finished running in one of those commissions myself, so I feel I think I can empathize what you may be going through right now. So my question was that the topic that you have, if I butcher your topic, you please clarify. My understanding is that if you're trying to prove that having a fair elections are very important for a country, or some other consequences, it seems to me how you go about proving empirically could easily backfire in a sense that, like your concluding remark about, okay, we have an unfair election and international communities really don't react anything, then where do we go? I mean, it seems to me like having a fair election is something that is sort of normative, and you have to have it. And if you go about proving it empirically that not having fair elections will have consequences, and you cannot prove that there's any negative consequences, then what are you going to do?
Right.
Change the data.
Be selective in the presentation of data. No, it's again from a narrow question of the health of democracy, right, for a country, and the ability of democracy to realize its various potentials. It's pretty easy to demonstrate that elections that are credible and conducted with integrity are important for a whole host of normative good things that democracy is supposed to deliver. So I'm not worried about that. The bigger issues, quite frankly, are ones of incentives, and two different kinds of incentives here. What are the incentives, for politicians, both incumbents and politicians, to engage in institutional reforms that will strengthen integrity in systems that they may benefit from a lack of integrity, right? And here I'm talking about a lot of the poorer democracies where leaders very successfully use patronage and corruption, right, to basically rig a system where even though you have elections, you might even have competition, but surprise, surprise, the incumbent always wins, right? So what are the incentives for them to change? And that to me is more difficult than, are there negative consequences or not? Just like, what are the incentives for international actors to do more? And even in the case of, looking at this, what it appears to me is the first question that international governments ask in any flawed election is there protest? And is the domestic protest sufficient enough that the incumbent might actually lose? That is, that there might be enough pressure, there might be enough stuff going on that you're actually going to have a transition. And if the answer is yes, then donors, international governments will then realize and say, aha, if we act in a certain way, we can help bring that result about, and we don't have to pay the consequences of having to deal, if it turns out wrong, and that's what they worry about, is you support protest, the protest is put down, and you've got the same leader, and then you've got to deal with that leader for 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, whatever it is, and you still have important issues that you've got to discuss with that leader, and he knows that you were trying to depose him. Usually a him, very rarely a her. So that one's easy. But then you say, well, in the absence, or maybe even normatively it should stop there. I mean, maybe that's the answer, right? If domestically you don't have protest and you don't have enough of mobilization domestically that there are constituents that are demanding integrity, maybe we shouldn't be fooling ourselves that international actors are going to do it in their absence. But still, it really is striking, the lack of response. I mean, just recently, for instance, you had these elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Over a year before the elections, the incumbent Kabila had changed the constitution, changed various electoral rules, and had basically stacked the, quote, independent National Election Commission with some of his cronies. It was very clear a year ago where this was headed. Nonetheless, election monitors went, right? And what they found was massive, massive irregularities, and some of which seemed a product of malpractice, and some of it just incompetence. But the observers did something that the observers often do, which is they said, all kinds of irregularities, all kinds of questions of credibility. In the end, though, it's hard for us to determine whether this would have changed the results. It's always been a mystery to me, like, why do you need to put that in? Why don't you just report massive, the basic credibility of this election is in doubt, period, right? And let others to draw the conclusions. But nothing. I mean, nothing from the EU, from the United States, South Africa, AU, nobody. Nobody took a stand on these incredibly flawed elections that lack even basic integrity, right? And that is more of the the rule of the day. And so the hardest thing for the commission is to say, all right, what are the incentives for the United States to take this more seriously, or the EU to take it more seriously, or donors to take it more seriously the next time? That one's, if you have answers to that question, that would really help me.
What permeated through most of your talk was many examples related to, really pointed towards vital interest rather than responsible sovereignty. And you've just given me the main example there with the elections in Congo, where you have vital interest within certain countries and certain minerals and resources and so forth there. So the issue, I believe, of responsible sovereignty, I think it's just another noise and smoke for vital interests. I mean, previously they used to use human rights and weapons of mass destructions in order to intervene into certain countries, such as Iraq is an example there. And the examples what you gave about America in relation to Iraq and Afghanistan and pulling out her troops, it was the economy. Yes, it was the economy. They're trying to save money there. In relation to the Arab Spring, again, it caught everybody unexpectedly, and they were riding and still are riding the wave of the Arab Revolution. So you'll see America treating countries differently. So, for example, in Egypt, at the beginning, they were afraid. They were in support of Mubarak. Then they backed down. and they still hold control of Egypt through the military. The people don't really have control there. In Syria, it's a totally different story. They don't have a replacement for Assad, who's actually protected American interest, if you look at the history and so forth there. Look at Bahrain, totally different situation. So the reality is vital interest, full stop. Thank you very much.
So let's talk about vital interests, because we clearly live in a world where states still have vital interests, perceive them, and formulate policy and act upon them. I also think that we live in a world in which norms do matter, and that ideas matter, and that there are concerns that don't fit into sort of traditional ideas about vital national interest. And so I guess I would formulate it a little differently than your formulation, where the responsibility to protect, to my mind, when it is endorsed and pursued, or has been pursued by states over the last 5 years, actually now 7 years since it was created, it's only, this is going to sound very cynical, but it's not that it's a screen for vital national interests. It's just that it tends to be applied when there's no apparent vital national interest, or where vital national interest leads in a different direction, right? Which is why the United States could act one way in the case of Egypt, but not in the case of Bahrain, right? So that would be my counter, is that the ideas that we have and the norms that we have do matter. It's just that we still live in a world where oftentimes traditional notions of vital national interest trump our commitment to these ideas and values and norms, but not always.
Good evening. I have, there's an issue that I wrestle with, and I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on, and it's about accountability. In a world where there is, globalization, and there's a lot more interaction, and where the decisions of one country can affect another, and not just another country, but another people. And the best example in this situation is what's been happening at the UN with regards to Syria. So the fact that Russia and China have used that veto repeatedly makes them accountable. And I mean, even regardless of the fact that the UN, even if they had passed that resolution and what might actually have come of it, regardless of that fact, but the fact that they actually blocked it, then they are accountable to the people in Syria. They're accountable to those cities that are now, under siege. So the question then becomes, how does this get resolved, or what avenues do we have going forward when they use the veto for their own personal interests, obviously, but then this obviously has very direct impacts for people on the ground. Thank you.
The question on accountability is a great one, and I think there is a kind of accountability. It's not legal accountability, and it's a bit inchoate and fluffy. But let me tease this out. I think the United States paid a price in terms of its foreign policy by its decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. And I think that price was that on a whole host of issues, they got less cooperation from countries than they did before. They got less cooperation from countries on issues than they did before because the decision by the United States was so unpopular with their people. That is, the United States incurred a cost or I'm sorry, governments that would cooperate with the United States would incur a cost because of popular anger and unhappiness with the United States decision. Now that's a very, it's a very, you know, again, it's kind of fluffy, but I do think it exists. And so if you're China and you've decided to veto this resolution, of which 150 countries would vote for, of which many people in Syria were hoping for, where many people around the region were hoping for, and many governments around the region were hoping for. The accountability is going to be how China is then perceived. Is it perceived as a government in the region that props up very unstable and unpopular dictators who are killing their own people? Right? That's the accountability that comes. It's never going to be a legal accountability, and it's not going to be a UN accountability. It's going to be the accountability of the street, and it's going to be the diffuse accountability that comes up in terms of willingness to cooperate on a whole host of issues. That would be my answer.
The question is about the legitimacy of global governance. The Syrian conflict in particular is raising questions about the legitimacy or the capability of the Arab League to respond to anything, really. And there are many countries in the GCC, for example, which are taking the lead, and they're showing that there's another option besides relying on the Arab League. So I was wondering, how does the question of legitimacy come into play when it comes to global governance for the Arab League? Thank you.
The legitimacy of global governance, you know, classic discussions of legitimacy, you know, always, you know, say there's two elements of legitimacy. One element of legitimacy is really about process, and in some instances about law. That is, do you have the right to do what you are doing, right? And then there's also the belief that a second type of legitimacy comes from whatever the rightful basis of your action, are you producing results, right? And having worked on global governance questions for about 15 years, it's always the second one that drives the discussion. Is that the discussion about what should you do, what is right to do, what is legal to do, all that stuff often gets trumped by, all right, in the end, did you solve the problem or not? Unfortunately, we often ignore all the things that actually global governance is pretty good at solving, right? You know, there are some things that, for instance, the WHO does in terms of health. There's things that happen in terms of travel, that happen in terms of transport. You know, there's actually a bunch of successes of global governance. We just tend to ignore those because we focus on whatever the issue of the day is, right? And whatever the issue of the day is generally tends to be the toughest issues. And the great temptation is to say, oh my God, we didn't solve X, so we're going to deny everything that we have solved, right? This stuff, you know, when a country is in crisis, this stuff is really difficult. That's sort of where I'd say. I would say that, again, the capability of the Arab League to respond may be in question. But again, you know, like I said, if we would go back 7 years ago and make a prediction about, you know, could you imagine the Arab League actually coming to some agreement that they were going to ask the UN to hold accountable various governments in the region? The answer would have been, no way in hell. Wouldn't happen, right? So again, take the long view.